September 21st, 1944. A thick silence blankets the French countryside until the distant growl of American tanks cuts through the morning fog. For German Panzer Commander Klaus Müller, this is just another day on the battlefield. He's seen Shermans roll in before. He's turned them into fireballs with a single well-placed shot. And he expects today to be no different. But then it happens. His first shot lands clean, solid hit. The tank doesn't explode. No flames, no twisted metal, just smoke and movement. Müller stares through his scope as the Sherman tank he thought was dead shrugs off the hit and keeps coming. He doesn't know it yet, but what he's just seen isn't a fluke. It's the start of a terrifying new phase in armored warfare. Because inside that tank is something no German commander had prepared for, a silent, invisible upgrade that turned the most vulnerable tank on the battlefield into one of the most survivable. And the real kicker? The Germans never even figured out what changed until the war was already lost. They called them Tommy Cookers. The Germans didn't whisper that nickname. They spat it with confidence. To them, the American M4 Sherman tank was little more than a mobile coffin, fast-moving, lightly armored, and terrifyingly easy to set on fire. And by mid-1944, it wasn't just a reputation. It was a grim reality. On the Western Front, German panzer divisions had made a horrifying habit of destroying Sherman tanks with mechanical precision. One solid shot from a Panther or a PaK-40 anti-tank gun, and boom, towering flames, a plume of black smoke, and a dead crew. Even Allied soldiers started using the nickname. Some called their Shermans Ronsons, after the lighter that lights every time. Brutally honest and terrifyingly accurate. For American tank crews, stepping into a Sherman was like loading into a gas tank on treads. If a German round penetrated the hull, especially from the side or rear, it didn't just disable the tank, it turned it into an inferno. Surviving a hit? That was luck. Escaping the flames? A miracle. Normandy. Summer of 1944. Fields turned to graveyards of smoking steel. The tide was turning in Europe. But for Allied tankers, every advance came with a sickening question. Who would be next? German commanders, like veteran Panzer Ace Klaus Müller, had grown ruthless behind their optics. From hidden positions across hedgerows and hilltops, they had watched round after round burn holes clean through Sherman hulls. Each fiery kill confirmed one thing. The Shermans were soft targets, easy to burn, easy to tally, and easy to fear. And that fear wasn't just felt by the Americans. German high command had come to depend on Shermans being vulnerable. Their tactics were built on it. Why hold the line when one good ambush could obliterate an entire armored column? Why worry about being outnumbered when every Sherman that came down the road practically carried its own funeral pyre? The confidence was so deeply embedded that Panzer manuals outright instructed crews to aim at the lower hull and ammunition racks, knowing full well what would happen if they hit the right spot. The result? Instant fire, cooked off ammo, 0 survivors. But here's where the story takes a turn. Because while Klaus Müller and thousands of other seasoned German gunners were busy counting their next easy kills, something inside those Shermans changed. Quietly, invisibly, completely. And no one, not even the Americans operating the tanks, understood just how deadly that change would become for the Germans. It's easy to forget just how important armor perceptions are in war. On the surface, a Sherman in fall 1944 looked identical to one built a year earlier. Same chassis, same turret, same profile. They even still caught fire sometimes, depending on which variant you were in. But underneath the steel, and hiding deep inside the design, was a revolution, born from fire and built in silence. Because no one wanted to say it out loud, but they had to fix the flaw. That single flaw, the way ammo was stored, was killing too many American tankers. So, in secret labs, in midnight meetings between engineers and generals, in factories fueled by urgency, an upgrade was born that seems quaint by modern standards. But at the time, it was a life-saving miracle. And, most important of all, the Germans never even knew it happened. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. To understand just how revolutionary this hidden change was, you have to understand just how deadly the old Shermans were for their own crew. Here's how it worked. Inside every early model Sherman The ammunition was stored along the sides and floor of the tank, easy access, sure, but with one fatal flaw. If the armor was pierced even once, hot fragments and fire from the blast could ignite the volatile shells almost immediately. And when an 88mm round from a Tiger hits that spot, it doesn't just damage the tank. It creates a chain reaction of death. Ammunition starts exploding like fireworks inside the crew compartment. Shrapnel ricochets in every direction. The fire burns so hot and fast, there's often no time to escape. Army reports from North Africa and early Italian campaigns showed something horrifying. Over 60% of all Shermans that were hit exploded into fireballs. Many left nothing more than twisted skeletons of steel baking in open fields. That wasn't just a problem. That was a strategy-breaking design failure. And to German commanders like Müller, it was their greatest advantage. But here's what makes this so important. That advantage was about to vanish. Overnight. The shock German crews would feel in the weeks to come seeing their shells land with precision and fail to kill would start rewriting the rules of armored combat. And while they tried to figure out how the Americans had suddenly stopped dying in droves, the truth was something they couldn't see. Because the upgrade wasn't about more armor. It wasn't a bigger gun. It wasn't camouflage or speed. It was what was hiding inside, right next to the ammunition. A simple, yet genius system that took America's most vulnerable weapon and made it terrifyingly resistant to exactly the type of destruction the Germans had come to rely on. The Allies weren't just fielding a new version of the Sherman. They were fielding a completely reimagined tank, disguised as the same old warhorse. And before long, panzer crews would start to notice something strange. Direct hits weren't working. Explosions weren't happening. Flames were missing. But by the time those reports reached command, it would already be too late. Because the stealthiest invention of the war wasn't a missile or a bomb, it was water. So what exactly was this secret technology that kept American tank crews alive when everyone expected them to burn? It wasn't a new weapon. It didn't make the Sherman faster. And it definitely didn't make it more heavily armored. It was water. That's right, water. The breakthrough that flew under the radar of every enemy officer and saved thousands of lives wasn't some cutting-edge armor alloy or top-secret explosive. It was a simple but revolutionary approach to how ammunition was stored inside the tank. The U.S. Army called it wet stowage, and it changed everything. The problem that almost broke the Sherman. Before we get into the secret itself, let's rewind to the root of the issue. The original Sherman tanks used what's now known as dry storage. Shells were kept in steel racks, nestled along the floor and walls of the tank close to the crew, and terrifyingly exposed. The ammo storage was convenient for reloading, but it was like sitting on top of a bomb. When a German round penetrated the hull, and they often did, it would slam straight into the ammunition rack. The intense heat, shrapnel, and kinetic energy could cook off the shells in a millisecond, resulting in catastrophic internal explosions. Most of the time, no one inside survived. Shermans didn't just lose battles, they became death traps. And this wasn't just anecdotal. By early 1943, classified reports from field hospitals and after-action investigations revealed a shocking trend. Over 60% of knocked-out Shermans were being destroyed not by mechanical failure, but by internal ammo explosions. Compare that to German panzers, a fire rate of just 15%. That's a massive gap, one that commanders could no longer ignore. Enter Dr. Richard Patterson at the Army Ordnance Department. Under mounting pressure from mounting body counts, one man took this personally. Dr. Richard Patterson was the chief Army engineer tasked with solving what soldiers grimly referred to as the Ronson issue. He wasn't a battlefield commander. He wasn't even a career soldier. But what he understood was physics, explosion dynamics, and American production lines. After poring over reports from Africa, Sicily, and Italy, Patterson came to a conclusion. The Sherman didn't necessarily need more armor. It needed to make its ammunition harder to ignite. An unlikely source of inspiration. As his team brainstormed solutions, an unexpected idea came from an unlikely voice. Colonel David Chen, a Marine officer with experience in the Pacific Theater. Chen had studied captured Japanese tank designs and discovered that some models used thin water jackets near critical components, including combustible systems. What if the same principle could be applied to ammunition storage? Instead of just hiding ammo behind armor plating, what if the rounds were physically surrounded by water? Water absorbs heat, disperses kinetic energy, and slows down chemical reactions. Maybe, just maybe, it could be enough to prevent ammunition from cooking off even if the tank was penetrated. It was an idea so simple, so practical, that it just might work. Testing the unbelievable. The first test bed was rolled out at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland in early 1944. Engineers took modified Sherman hulls and installed water-filled compartments surrounding the ammo racks with narrow tanks of sealed liquid. Then, they loaded the vehicles with live ammunition and fired captured German rounds directly into them. The results stunned even the testers themselves. Fires dropped from 62% to just 18%. That's a 70% reduction in catastrophic explosions in controlled battlefield conditions. It wasn't just an upgrade. It was a complete transformation of the tank's survivability. Captain William Foster, the lead test officer at Aberdeen, sent an internal memo with a line that perfectly captured what happened. "We have turned a flaming coffin into a fighting chance." That sentence would never see the light of day publicly, at least not during the war. And for good reason. The Germans couldn't know. The wet stowage upgrade was so effective, so quietly revolutionary, that American command declared it top secret. If German intelligence learned how Sherman's survivability had improved, it could have massive consequences. They might revise their targeting strategies, focus fire on the engine bay or fuel cells, train gun crews to bypass weakened ammo vulnerability. In short, they'd adapt fast. But if they stayed in the dark, if they thought the Shermans were still vulnerable, still the same flammable targets, that would create a battlefield illusion, one the Americans could exploit. So, the decision was made. Keep it quiet. Very quiet. Even most American tank crews were never fully briefed on what had changed. They were just told their new tanks were safer and had been reconfigured. That was it. No technical secrets, no diagrams. If captured, they'd have nothing specific to reveal. This intentional silence was one of the smartest operational moves of the entire war, building a better tank, one tank at a time. But creating wet stowage Sherman's wasn't as easy as flipping a switch. To implement the system, tank factories had to be retooled. Major changes to the internal structure were required. Water jackets added weight, bulk, and costs. Fitting them into tight interior spaces was engineering gymnastics. General Motors, Chrysler, and other contractors were not happy. More materials, slower production, reduced top speed, skyrocketing costs. In short, it risked slowing down the entire war machine. But one man, Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, saw the writing on the wall. This wasn't about numbers on a spreadsheet. This was about keeping the same soldiers in the same tanks long enough to win battles. He overruled corporate resistance and ordered every new Sherman designed for Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, to include the wet stowage system, starting in March of 1944. And in doing so, he quietly saved thousands of lives. The secret rolls into battle. When the Shermans landed at Normandy in June, there were two versions. The old ones, with ammo just waiting to explode, and the new ones, silently protected by water jackets hidden inside steel walls. To German gunners, they all looked the same. To American crews, they didn't know why, but something felt different. Tanks were taking hits and surviving. Crews were fighting longer, fireballs were less frequent, confidence was building. No one on the German side had any idea what had changed. And by the time anyone started asking the right questions, they were already losing the war. It started with a direct hit. An armor-piercing shell sliced through the fog, aimed with deadly precision by veteran German gunner Hans Weber. His Panzer IV crew had stared down dozens of Shermans before always the same result. One hit, one fireball, one kill. So when the first American tank crested the ridge near the village of Fillet that morning in September 1944, Weber had no reason to expect anything different. Crack! The German round screamed through the air. Direct hit square in the lower hull. But what happened next stunned every man watching. No explosion. No flames. Nothing. The Sherman shuddered slightly, and then kept moving. Turret turning, gun tracking, tracks grinding forward, the crew inside alive. Weber blinked in disbelief. "Felsius?" he muttered. "Missed?" Impossible. He'd hit that same spot dozens of times before and watched tanks go up like Roman candles. But this one just stayed in the fight. A new kind of nightmare. From his concealed position behind a crumbling stone farmhouse, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Müller, one of the most experienced panzer commanders on the Western Front, raised his field glasses. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Sherman after Sherman, moving through the kill zone, taking hits and refusing to die. One had its side armor punctured by an 88 mm and still rolled forward, belching smoke but showing no fire. Another took 2 consecutive hits and then fired back before reversing behind cover. Müller turned to his second in command. "Was zur Hölle? What in hell is happening?" He didn't know it yet, but those tanks were his worst nightmare. Shermans with wet stowage. The fog of war and intelligence. Over the preceding months, American engineers had quietly redefined the battlefield. But the Germans were still playing by the old rules. Their assumptions, Shermans always explode when penetrated, were now dangerously outdated. German intelligence reports still referred to the M4 tanks as ammunition traps. Strategic briefings emphasized targeting ammo compartments for quick kills. Training manuals included diagrams showing exactly where to hit for maximum destruction. Every German gunner on that line had been taught, get the angle, punch through the side, watch it burn. But on this day, nothing was burning. A turning point in tank warfare. Up ahead in the formation, Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison sat in the lead Sherman of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division's advance. By now, he'd seen his fair share of battlefield chaos. Normandy, the hedgerows, Cannes. But this moment felt different. He watched through his periscope as German shells pinged off his platoon's armor, or worse, penetrated without killing anyone. Inside his own tank, one round struck just inches from the ammo rack. In a dry stowage Sherman, that would have meant instant death, but not this time. Instead of a fireball, there was just a metallic clang, a flicker of sparks, and a stunned silence. "Still with me?" Harrison called out. "Still here," his driver shouted back. They were alive. The weight of a secret. What's haunting about this moment is that many American crews still didn't fully understand the difference. They just knew something had changed. In training, they'd been told, the new tanks are a little safer, but no one had spelled it out. There were no breakdowns of the wet stowage system, no diagrams explaining the internal water jackets. Even tank commanders often assumed the extra protection came from added armor or just luck. But it wasn't luck. Underneath their boots, those carefully hidden water jackets were absorbing blistering heat, deflecting flame, and stopping a nightmare before it could start. And the psychological shift was immediate. Crews began pressing forward harder. Shots that would have made them panic a month ago were now followed by, "Still good. Keep going." Confusion behind enemy lines. Back on the German side, chaos was unfolding at the command level. Reports of surviving Shermans came flooding into Sector HQ. AT gunners were panicked. Several claimed their shots were duds. Others swore the Americans had developed invisible armor. Oberst Friedrich von Manstein, a ruthless and respected Panzer Division leader, read the day's combat reports near Mortain with growing disbelief. Engaged 6 Sherman tanks, 5 direct hits. Only 2 burned. Remaining tanks returned fire and maneuvered behind terrain. This wasn't a fluke. This was a pattern, and it was starting to break German confidence. Von Manstein slammed his fist on the table. Find out what they've changed immediately. But that was easier said than done, because the few Shermans the Germans did capture were either completely destroyed, too mangled to study, or outdated dry stowage versions that reinforced their false assumptions. Tanks that should have died, but didn't. Back on the ground, units like Major Robert Williams' 2nd Armored Tank Company were adjusting tactics in real time. Williams had been there in the dark days, Normandy hedgerows, 1 round and you were gone. He'd lost crewmen, friends. Entire platoons turned to charcoal in seconds. Now his men were pushing harder, getting closer, firing more aggressively. One tank in his formation had taken 3 direct impacts in 1 hour and still returned to base under its own power. The back deck was scorched. The radio was fried. But the crew? Still laughing. Williams realized something crucial. We don't just have another tank, we have an edge, and the enemy doesn't know it yet. The moment. Müller knew. By late afternoon, Klaus Müller's unit was in full retreat. The Shermans weren't invincible, but they were no longer dying the way they were supposed to. Every hit that didn't result in fire shattered German expectations, undermining years of hard-earned tactics and training. He sat inside his Panzer, rereading the damage logs from the morning. 12 Shermans engaged. 7 hit. Only 1 exploded. "They've changed," he whispered to himself. "The damn tanks have changed." Not just tactic psychology. The first wet stowage battles weren't just about who had the better machine. They were about what happens when one side believes it has the advantage, and slowly, painfully realizes it doesn't anymore. German gun crews, who had once fired with cocky precision, now hesitated after their first shot missed its mark. Allied tankers, who had once braced themselves for annihilation, now returned fire with fury. The battlefield was shifting not in guns, not in numbers, but in the minds of the men who fought there. And those first wet stowage engagements marked the beginning of a terrifying truth for Germany. They hadn't just miscalculated, they had no idea what they were really up against. January 15th, 1944. Inside the vast industrial expanse of the Chrysler tank arsenal in Detroit, machines roared day and night. Sparks flew from welding torches. Steel clashed. Deadlines loomed. The U.S. military was gearing up for the final push in Europe, and they needed tanks fast. But deep in the engineering offices buried behind the production floor, a storm was brewing. Because what Army engineers were proposing wasn't a simple performance tweak or bolt-on fix. They were recommending a total overhaul of the Sherman's internal design, and not everyone was on board. Stop the line? Are you insane? When Dr. Richard Patterson, the Army Ordnance Department engineer leading the redesign project, presented his wet stowage concept to production executives, the reaction was immediate and angry. General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford had all retooled their factories to mass-produce Shermans on a wartime rush schedule. The tanks rolled out on assembly lines like cars, one every few minutes. Any delay, any redesign meant fewer tanks rolling off the line. And American high command needed quantity. Fast. Tanks win wars. Delays lose them. One executive reportedly warned. Patterson's redesign added weight, required internal layout changes, and slowed production. Water jackets around ammunition racks needed additional fittings, hoses, and sealing systems. Installing them meant cutting open the very heart of the tank's structure. This wasn't just an adjustment. It was a full-blown intervention. The human cost of speed. For commanders up top, the calculus was brutal. Speed equals more tanks. More tanks iguale a more firepower. More firepower equals victory. But Patterson and the battlefield data told a different story. All these Shermans being pumped out by the thousands? They were dying just as fast. Because producing a tank that burst into flames the second it was hit didn't win wars, it just replaced the last crew that burned alive. The cold numbers didn't lie. Dry stowage Shermans were suffering ammo fires in 6 out of 10 hits. German tanks? Just 1 to 2 out of 10. If nothing changed, casualties would keep piling up. Crews would lose faith in their machines. And German forces would continue exploiting America's biggest weakness. Patterson's solution wasn't elegant. It wasn't flashy. But it worked. Now, he just needed someone with the authority and courage to force it through. The man who made the call. Enter Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, commander of U.S. Army Ground Forces and one of the few men in Washington who truly understood the cost of rushed production. McNair wasn't an engineer. He was a strategist, but he had eyes on the battlefield reports, and they painted a grim reality. Too many seasoned tankers were dying, not because of bad tactics, but because their tanks turned into crematoriums the moment a round got through. It had to stop. So, while manufacturers pushed back, logistics teams complained, and defense contractors pleaded to keep the status quo, McNair drew a line. He issued a classified directive in February 1944. Effective immediately, all new M4 Sherman variants destined for European deployment are to be equipped with wet stowage ammunition storage systems. Production adjustments are a secondary priority. That one sentence rewrote the future of American armored warfare. Retooling under pressure, the order sent shockwaves through the tank industry. Factories across the country had to shut down small sections of their lines just to handle the redesign. Engineers worked around the clock, redesigning mounts, rewiring turret feeds, and reinforcing ammo trays. Every new component, from water jackets to drainage valves, was a logistical nightmare. How much water to use? What about freezing temperatures? Could the tanks be drained if service was needed? Would rust become an issue? Patterson's team fielded dozens of these concerns, some valid, many panicked. But slowly, steadily, the changes came to life. By March 1944, the first wet stowage Shermans were rolling off the line. Slightly heavier, slightly more expensive, but infinitely more survivable. A classified shield. But even as the first tanks were shipped out for deployment, the truth about the upgrade remained a tightly held secret. American military officials feared that if German intelligence uncovered details about the new protection system, they'd shift their anti-tank tactics, redesign their weapons, or concentrate fire elsewhere on the tank's weaker spots. So, the wet stowage system was buried in red tape and silence. Commanders were issued strict memos not to discuss the system in letters, home, briefings, or field reports. Maintenance crews were told only what they needed to know. And tank crews? They got the bare minimum. Your new models got improved ammo safety. Keep it sealed and watch your water levels. That was it. No explanations. No schematics. Just quiet confidence that this version wouldn't cook off quite so easily. Even after battle, when crews survived hits that should have been fatal, there was no detailed explanation. Just a shrug and a half-joking remark. Guess we got lucky. But it wasn't luck. It was design. Purposeful, intentional design. Tanks with a secret identity. By May 1944, wet stowage tanks were being loaded by the dozens onto transport ships bound for England. The timing couldn't have been better. Operation Overlord D-Day was just weeks away, and as Allied armor prepared to hit the beaches of Normandy, America was quietly fielding two kinds of Shermans: dry stowage models, the original tanks with ammo exposed, like a powder keg; wet stowage survivors, the upgraded warriors with built-in protection no one outside the command chain fully understood. The distinction? Hidden. The impact? Massive. And with so many tanks flooding Europe under pressure, even tank crews often had no idea which kind they were fighting in until someone got hit. Paying the price or changing the war? For McNair, Patterson, and the decision-makers who risked delay, the gamble was near unthinkable. Slow wartime output, just to fix something inside the tanks that no one could even see. But within weeks of frontline combat, it became clear. That decision had saved lives, thousands of them. It had preserved battle-hardened crews from sudden death. It had given American tankers the courage to fight harder and longer. And it had thrown off everything the Germans thought they knew about American armor. Because no one, not even the enemy shell gunners staring through their scopes, could spot the difference just by looking. All they knew was this: the Shermans weren't dying like they used to. And something was very, very wrong. June 6th, 1944 D-Day. As waves of American tanks rolled ashore onto the beaches of Normandy, a storm of artillery, machine gun fire, and anti-tank shells awaited them inland. The landing zones were chaos, waterlogged, cratered, and crawling with German bunkers. But among the thunder of war, something else crept ashore. Something secret. Because hidden inside some of those Shermans, though not all was a game-changing edge, no one could see from the outside. And even more terrifying, no one really knew which was which. A lethal lottery. By June, only about 40% of American Sherman tanks shipped to Europe had been upgraded with wet stowage. The rest? Still running the original dry ammunition setup, the exact flaw German tank crews had been exploiting for 2 years straight. But from the outside, there was zero visible difference between the two variants. Same dimensions, same shape, same armor thickness. For soldiers inside, it was a Russian roulette of survivability. One hit could mean a victory. The same hit to the tank parked next to you, a funeral pyre. The survivors and the smoke columns. The first major armored pushes inland were brutal. On the flanks of Normandy, Sherman crews engaged dug-in POC 40 seconds and Panther tanks hiding behind thick hedgerows. In many encounters, it only took one shot to tell if your tank had the upgrade or not. Captain Samuel Rodriguez, who led an armored platoon during the Cotentin Peninsula push, explained it later. I remember one morning outside St. Lo. We rolled into an open field, 3 tanks side by side. One on my left took a round and vanished in smoke. No survivors. He got hit right after. Same angle, same shot. My ears rang. The inside was cooked, but we were alive. That's the day we started believing in angels or engineering. Rodriguez's Sherman had wet stowage. His comrades didn't. No one told the crews. The secrecy around wet stowage ran so deep, most tank units landed in France completely unaware of the upgrade, even those equipped with it. Official field briefings made vague references to enhanced ammo protection or fire reduction modifications, but nothing that would tip off German intelligence if a soldier was ever captured. Some crews noticed a difference. After surviving close calls, you'd hear whispers. New armor plates, maybe? I think this new model puts the ammo deeper in the back. Mine runs heavier. Must be extra steel. They had no idea it was just gallons of water housed inside protective jackets. And yet, the effect, psychological and physical, was staggering. Crews in wet stowage tanks fought longer, pushed harder, and took risks that would have been suicidal with older variants. They didn't always understand why they were lasting longer in engagements, but their instincts told them something had changed. Fog of war and the fire that still lingered. Of course, not every tank was lucky. Units battered by German ambushes in thick terrain like the Bocage country suffered heavy casualties, especially those still fielding dry stowage models. Flames and black smoke continued to dot the French countryside as Shermans were struck by armor-piercing rounds from Panther and Tiger tanks. For every crew that walked away from a hit, there was another lost in fire. The tragedy was that both tanks had the same name, but only one carried the hidden advantage. And still, the Germans didn't suspect a thing. The Germans start to notice something's off. That summer, high-value German commanders like Oberst Friedrich von Manstein began receiving strange reports from anti-tank divisions west of Caen. Hits confirmed. No fire. Turrets still moving. Unclear if enemy tanks are improved. Recommend closer examination. Infantry unable to disable forward Shermans via previous known weak spots. At first, German analysts believed it was coincidence. Bad angles. Duds. Maybe Allied crews were just getting faster at evacuating. But after the battles near Mortain, suspicions grew darker. A Jagdpanzer IV had engaged 6 Shermans in a narrow valley. 5 projectiles had landed clean. Only 2 tanks ignited. The others took damage, retreated, and returned minutes later, patched up and ready. That wasn't normal. Old assumptions equals new mistakes. Even with growing doubts, the German high command remained locked in outdated thinking. For so long, the Sherman had been easy prey, a fact they had built their doctrine around. Every anti-tank crew knew exactly where to aim to spark catastrophic detonation. But now, with targets no longer reacting the same, those tried and true tactics began to fail in real combat. Shots designed to trigger ammo explosions were falling flat. Flames that were expected never came. In the words of one German interrogator, as recorded months later from captured Wehrmacht transcripts, it was like hunting in fog. We had the same weapons, they had the same tanks, but something had changed and none of us knew what. A slow, silent shift. As the summer campaign pushed eastward toward Paris, American units began rotating in new tanks, most of them equipped with wet stowage. The percentage of Shermans built with the system rose from 40% in June to over 70% by September. That shift slowly turned the tide of armored warfare not with firepower, but by removing a vulnerability the enemy had spent years perfecting their tactics around. Tankers who once hesitated under fire now held ground. Commanders who once spread tanks wide to reduce risk now pushed closer, exploiting terrain and numbers. And the Germans? They were still shooting at ghosts, chasing a weakness that no longer existed. Life and death inside the same hull. There's something especially haunting about this phase of the war. Men lived or burned based on internal plumbing they never saw. 2 tanks, same model, same training, same mission. But only one would come back because of a difference buried deep within the steel, built in secrecy, implemented against pressure, and invisible to everyone except death itself. September 1944. The tide of war in Europe is finally, visibly turning. American armor is flooding across French farmland, rolling through shattered towns under a storm of artillery and diesel exhaust. And something is deeply wrong not for the Americans, but for the Germans. What began as a whisper among panzer divisions has become a full-blown crisis behind enemy lines. The Shermans aren't burning anymore. The cracks begin to show. German gun crews on the Western Front had stopped celebrating successful hits. In France, in Belgium, in pockets of the Alsace region, reports kept streaming in. Hits were confirmed, penetration was clean. But the results? No explosion. No fire. The tank fight's on. For seasoned panzer commanders who'd watched Sherman tanks light up like torches since the deserts of North Africa, this wasn't just confusing, it was terrifying. Oberleutnant Hans Weber's combat report from an engagement near the town of Tournai said it best. 2 Shermans struck in 7 minutes. One rolled backward under smoke but did not burn. The second kept advancing. Gunners believe we were hallucinating. Orders questioned mid-firefight. Atmosphere shaken. Müller speaks up and gets ignored. Klaus Müller, the same veteran commander who had first noticed something strange near Falaise, submitted a formal report up the chain for the second time. The language was careful but urgent. Recent engagements suggest modification to American tanks is possible. Recommend immediate analysis of recovered units. Survivability well beyond previous norms. He never received a response. At this stage in the war, Germany's command structure was crumbling under the pressure of multi-front battles, fuel shortages, and morale collapse. Field reports were piling up in dusty HQs, ignored in favor of desperate orders and retreat planning. And more importantly, even when tanks were recovered, they told the wrong story. A dangerous illusion. Because here's the irony. The few Sherman tanks that did fall into German hands, they were dry stowage models. Outdated versions. Maybe they'd been abandoned. Maybe their crews didn't know they didn't have the newer protection systems. German intelligence officers dissected these tanks, saw the same internal layout they expected, and came to a fatal conclusion. The Americans have not improved survivability. Field reports are exaggerated. Continue standard engagement doctrine. A deadly assumption, because while engineers in Berlin pored over the wrong blueprints, the right kind of Shermans were tearing through their lines. The blind spot of the Reich. Colonel Max Weber, a German military intelligence officer stationed east of Cologne, spent the autumn of 1944 desperately trying to understand what was happening. He wasn't a tank commander. He wasn't even assigned to hardware analysis, but the contradictions in the reports were too bizarre to ignore. From one of his decrypted memos, photographic recon shows heavy tank damage with few destroyed hulls, explosions and fire damage below expected levels. Allied recovery of wrecks is swift, cannot assess internal configurations. Weber's biggest challenge? Lack of access. The Americans were meticulously recovering, or destroying, any damaged Shermans. The newer wet stowage models, when hit, rarely exploded, giving crews enough time to retreat, signal for help, or self-destruct the vehicle before it could be captured intact. All the Germans saw were occasional hulls, blackened, abandoned, and old. That critical sampling bias meant German engineers were working with the exact data the Americans wanted them to see. Desperation from the front lines upward. The mounting confusion started bleeding into German tactical planning. In staff meetings at Panzer headquarters, field commanders reported the same unsettling trend. Shells penetrating Shermans, but ammo not cooking off. Crews surviving direct hits. Tank platoons staying in the fight long after first contact. At one pointed staff briefing in late October 1944, General Heinz Guderian, Germany's Inspector General of Armored Forces, slammed his fist on the table after reading yet another first-hand account describing American tanks taking damage and refusing to ignite. "They have changed something and we failed to see it," he muttered, flipping over a report. "We are fighting the wrong way with outdated assumptions." But it was too late. Germany had no time, no captured models, and no unified intelligence system capable of urgently identifying what the Americans had done. The weapon they couldn't see. What made wet stowage so effective and so hard to detect was its elegance. There was no new armor plating. There were no external clues. From the outside, a wet stowage Sherman looked exactly like its older twin. But inside, the ammo racks had been moved, relocated to low-lying compartments surrounded by sealed water jackets, steel-lined pockets filled with liquid that sprayed or dampened any ignition caused by penetrating rounds. If a shell got through, it now had to pass through several inches of water before reaching the ammunition. And even if it made it that far, the ignition energy was blunted, smothered before it could start a deadly chain reaction. In testing, ammo fire rates dropped from 62% to under 20%. On the battlefield, The effect felt like black magic to stun German gunners. Field intelligence breaks down. Further, Colonel Weber eventually submitted one final urgent memo to High Command, just days before the German Ardennes offensive was set to begin. Sherman tanks are exhibiting survivability inconsistent with previously known capabilities. Recommend priority capture of functioning models for examination. That request was denied. His unit was ordered to refocus on decoding Allied communications rather than pawing through Allied armor, which was considered of lower immediate priority. The irony? That memo likely crossed the desk of someone still watching outdated American propaganda reels showing flaming Shermans in North Africa. No one at the top understood how much the battlefield had already changed. The collapse of confidence. But Panzer Division did. As the Americans pushed deeper into Europe, German tank crews began suffering something unexpected: doubt. And in war, doubt is poison. They no longer felt confident that a clean shot would mean a guaranteed kill. There was hesitation behind the trigger. A round fired, then silence, then movement from the target. Surprised screaming across the comm lines. In a war of nerves, nothing is more destructive than unpredictability. And Sherman crews? They noticed. Tankers who once approached engagements cautiously were now charging, relying on improved survivability and the enemy's fear of misreading the situation to gain the upper hand. American tanks were still being knocked out, still lost in battle, but fewer crew deaths, fewer fireballs, more crews returning from fights that would have been fatal just months earlier. It wasn't just tactical advantage, it was psychological warfare, and the Germans were losing it. A final attempt at the truth. By February 1945, Colonel Max Weber's team, now operating out of a bombed-out schoolhouse near Bonn, finally made contact with a frontline squad that had captured a mostly intact Sherman tank positioned behind a collapsed barn. When they cracked it open, stowage model. Again. And so, the fatal misunderstanding was reinforced once more. Carpet bombing had damaged rail lines. Troop movements were delayed. Intel couldn't match pace with battlefield evolution. American engineers had bought silence through design, and they used it like a weapon. We were fighting yesterday's war. Veteran gunner Klaus Müller would survive the war. Captured by Allied forces near Frankfurt in April 1945, he was debriefed during post-war interrogations. When asked about the supposed Sherman upgrade, he said something quiet, something heavy. "We kept aiming at ghosts. They stopped burning, and nobody could tell us why. We weren't just outnumbered, we were outdated. Fighting yesterday's war against tomorrow's enemy." That comment would later be cited in military case studies on adaptive versus rigid warfare. The intelligence failure that changed the war. Historians today call it one of the largest technical intelligence failures of World War II. Despite Germany's historically excellent engineering corps, despite years of dominance in tank warfare, despite field-level observations proving something had changed, they missed it. The US had slipped in an invisible upgrade, tested it in secret, fielded it discreetly, and never let the enemy see what they'd done until it was embedded into thousands of tanks flooding into Germany. By the time Berlin realized the real Sherman weakness was gone, the war was already over. December 16th, 1944. The snow-covered Ardennes forest, Belgium. At first, it looked like fog. Mist rolled between pine trunks, blanketing frozen roads. American soldiers, many barely 20 years old, rubbed frost from periscopes and idly scanned the trees. Then came the sound. Low at first, like distant thunder. Tanks. German tanks. Hundreds of them. And just like that, Germany's last major offensive of the war had begun. A surprise blitz in the cold. Hitler called it Operation Walk am Rhein, but history would remember it as the Battle of the Bulge. This was Germany's final gamble. Their all-in move. Elite panzer divisions, including SS units outfitted with Tiger IIs and Panther tanks, were thrown into the snow with orders to punch through Allied lines and retake Antwerp. The Americans were caught off guard. This sector had been considered quiet, lightly defended. But among the chaos, wet stowage Sherman tanks were about to face their greatest test. Captain Samuel Rodriguez back in the fire. Captain Rodriguez, patched up but battle-hardened after nearly 6 months in France, now commanded a full company of M4A3E8 Shermans, the latest model, with stowage ammunition protection, improved suspension systems for maneuverability in terrain, and most importantly, Cruz, who'd already faced the worst and survived. His unit was stationed near Bastogne, a critical Belgian road junction under threat from advancing panzer formations. When the offensive hit, Rodriguez barely had time to rally his crews before the sky turned to thunder. The first contact. At dawn, German artillery began pounding American positions. Fire bases were shattered. Trees exploded. In the chaos, SS Panzer Grenadiers surged forward, flanked by Panther tanks and Tiger IIs, some of the most powerful armored vehicles of the war. Rodriguez's Shermans were outgunned and out-armored on nearly every technical level. But they had one thing the Germans didn't know about: survivability. And now, it was about to be tested under fire, man to man, tank to tank, round after round, and still fighting. Within the first hour, 2 of Rodriguez's Shermans took direct hits. One was hit dead center by a Tiger II shell, the kind that split tanks open like tin cans. But instead of a fireball, the tank smoked and shuddered and kept rolling. Inside, the crew was shaken. Systems were damaged, but the ammo hadn't detonated. Rodriguez remembered what his gunner shouted over the radio: "We're still here, sir. We're still fighting." Another Sherman took 2 glancing hits to the upper hull. A year ago, automatic kill. Today, the crew bailed out without a scratch. No kaboom, no funeral. Instead, 2 tankers shrugged the snow off their jackets and jumped into a reserve vehicle. The SS Panzer reaction confusion. At the German firing positions, confusion set in immediately. SS gunner Udo Weiss, operating a Panther tank with 12 confirmed kills, couldn't process what he was seeing. Smoke, yes. Hits, definitely. But no explosions? His commander ordered him to fire again. Same result. They switched from HE rounds to armor-piercing. They fired at angles that historically guaranteed a Sherman fire. Still nothing. He radioed to HQ. Enemy tanks displaying severe abnormal resistance to internal fires. Armor penetration no longer catastrophic. Confirm advisory? No advisory came. Shift in American tactics. Confidence surged through Rodriguez's company. Previously, Sherman crews had been trained to engage at long distance, using sheer numbers and cautious spacing to tip engagements in their favor. But now, the tanks began to move in closer, working in tight, coordinated flanks that would have been suicide 6 months ago. Rodriguez's tanks closed the gaps, fired point-blank into German armor, then peeled away before return fire could knock them out. They maneuvered faster, fought harder, and didn't hesitate. One platoon advanced within 100 meters of a German anti-tank nest and wiped it out before the enemy finished aiming. As one American loader put it, "It's the first time I've ever been in a tank and thought, yeah, this might actually work." Big picture results, the defense holds. Bastogne was surrounded. Supplies were cut. Weather was brutal. Morale was low. But the American defense, reinforced by armored divisions equipped with wet stowage tanks, held the line. Where older tank units might have been obliterated by the weight of the attack, newer Shermans with crews that survived hits and fought back harder created a wall of steel the German offensive couldn't punch through. Attrition flipped. Every Sherman that survived a hit and kept its crew alive was one less replacement needed. One more unit that stayed in the fight. It was war by endurance. And the Shermans, for once, could endure. The myth dies in the fog. For German forces, everything they thought they knew about the Sherman tank was falling apart. The nickname, Tommy Cooker, dead. The soft target strategy, failed. The belief in ammo rack explosions as reliable kills, gone. German morale took a hit it never recovered from. By the end of December, more than 700 Sherman tanks took varying levels of damage across the Ardennes sector. Of those with wet stowage, casualties dropped dramatically. Statistics began to reflect what crews had been seeing firsthand. Catastrophic ammo fires fell by more than 70% during the offensive. Survival rates for hits from standard German AT rounds improved across all tank battalions. A veteran's perspective. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien, leader of a Sherman tank crew since before D-Day, summed it up in an interview recorded after the battle. 3 direct hits, 3 different guns. We should have been cooked, but we all made it out every time. Before, if you got hit, you'd scream and pray. Now we just hang on and shoot back. His words rippled across units like wildfire. The myth of the death trap tank was breaking right on the battlefield. The turning point of the war. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's final offensive flex, the last time Hitler's forces would go on the attack in the West. And the invisible edge in American tank survivability became one of the least recognized, yet most consequential reasons why that offensive ultimately failed. Germany threw everything it had at the Allied lines, but forgot one vital detail. They were still aiming at a tank that no longer existed. The final psychological blow. What wet stowage changed wasn't just survival. It shattered the German tactical mindset at its core. When bullets bounce off tanks, it's frustrating. When tanks take hits and light up the sky in flames, it's motivating. But when the same shot you fired 100 times does nothing now, that's demoralizing. It makes a gunner hesitate. A commander question target priority. A squad delay follow-through, and in armored warfare, seconds are everything. The Americans, on the other hand, leaned into it. By early 1945, crews weren't just surviving, they were confident, aggressive, quicker to advance, and more brutal in retaliation. A secret proved in fire. The Germans never fully figured it out. Even after the war, it wasn't until captured engineers were debriefed that they realized exactly what had changed in the Shermans. Not armor, not speed, just where the ammo was kept. That's it. The ammo was in a new place, surrounded by water, engineered with silence and efficiency. That simple adjustment helped flip the offensive advantage in the last 6 months of the war. And in the Battle of the Bulge, it passed the ultimate test. It didn't look like a revolution. Wet stowage wasn't glamorous. There were no flashy announcements, no new turret designs, no roaring speeches about America's next great tank. In fact, most of the crews who used it didn't even know what it was. But by early 1945, well after the Ardennes offensive had failed, the U.S. military command knew exactly what they had on their hands. They didn't just have more tanks. They had more survivors. And survivors win wars. The strategic effect of staying alive. In modern military theory, survivability is often treated as a defensive stat, something passive, something that just buys you time. But what commanders began to realize during the winter of 1944-45 was this: survivability creates options. And in war, options are power. When a Sherman tank could take a hit and still keep moving, or at the very least, leave the battlefield with its crew intact, it didn't just improve that moment's odds. It reshaped long-term strategy. Here's why. Fewer catastrophic kills meant fewer tanker deaths. Fewer crew deaths meant less retraining. Less retraining meant stronger unit cohesion. Stronger cohesion meant better coordination and faster tactical reactions. And better reactions meant more battlefield wins. It became a chain reaction in reverse, one that started with a single stream of water around a box of explosives. Units that changed how they fought. By early 1945, reports from field officers began to sound dramatically different than those filed months earlier. Colonel Bruce C. Clark, commander of Combat Command A from the 4th Armored Division, summarized it clearly during a tactical briefing. We're seeing aggressive advances we couldn't execute 6 months ago. Crews aren't holding back. They're initiating contact, using terrain, flanking more effectively. Not because they're braver, but because they know they won't be vaporized if they make a mistake. In past engagements, tank commanders would often hang back, keeping themselves at distance, using indirect fire to avoid giving enemy anti-tank units a clean shot. Now, they were beginning to take the initiative. Wet stowage had quietly enabled more risk-tolerant armored doctrine, the kind you need when you're fighting your way toward Berlin. The psychological shift. This wasn't just a technical or logistical evolution, it was mental warfare in action. Sherman tankers, who once treated every battle like a waiting game, who's going to burn first, began acting like predators instead of prey. There was a subtle swagger returning. Reports described units that were previously timid in their advances now, driving the enemy from cover. And that confidence spread fast. Confidence reduces hesitation. Confidence accelerates reaction time. Confidence makes coordinated attacks easier, cleaner, deadlier. Just as fear had crippled morale in 1942-43, survivability was turbocharging it in 1945. Rodriguez's tank company, for example, went from a high-casualty unit in late 1944 to one of the first across the Rhine River without a single onboard ammo fire loss. Why? Because their tanks took hits, kept moving, and kept fighting. Logistics reinvented fewer replacements, more momentum. Now let's talk logistics, the hidden skeleton of any war machine. Before the introduction of wet stowage, American tank battalions had to plan for massive crew and equipment losses every time they faced serious armor resistance. That meant replacement personnel. It meant spare vehicles. It meant field hospitals and rehab rotations. In short, it meant slowing down. But wet stowage turned that entire equation on its head. In operations that would have once decimated an armored unit, tanks were now coming back scorched but functional, or at least intact enough to repair. Maintenance reports from February 45 logged a 32% increase in recovered without fire damage tanks compared to late 1944. That number changed everything. Tanks could be repaired, not replaced. Crews could be rotated, not replaced. Campaigns could continue, not pause. Suddenly, winter offensives deep into German territory, once considered strategically risky due to logistics strain, became possible. Because the tanks now had staying power, strategic planning gets more aggressive. High-level planners at Chef, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, began factoring survivability into their offensive design models. Missions were now calculated on the assumption that more Shermans would survive direct action. This allowed for sustained pressure across multiple fronts without the traditional fallback scheduling. Take Operation Lumberjack, for example, the final push to the Rhine in March 1945. Armored divisions led the charge straight into fortified German positions, knowing they could absorb punishment and keep rolling. That wouldn't have been feasible a year earlier, when one lucky German shot could wipe out an entire Sherman crew. Now, commanders could plan waves of armor that functioned more flexibly, with more confidence and more speed because the risk curve had dropped. German strategic collapse. On the German side, this new edge simply wasn't understood until it was far too late. They continued fighting, as if Shermans would still brew up at the first sign of trouble. Doctrine was unchanged. Engraved tactics in panzer manuals still detailed the sweet spots for setting Shermans ablaze. And when that playbook stopped working, no one adapted in time. The psychological impact was real. Panzer crews watched Shermans take hits and keep coming. It created post-engagement shock, confusion, tactical stalling. And once that hesitation crept in, American armor gained the thing it couldn't buy 6 months earlier: momentum. How infantry benefited from hidden tech? Interestingly, infantry divisions began reporting indirect benefits from improved tank survivability. Tank infantry coordination in hedgerow country had always been dicey. If the Sherman burned up, the infantry was often left hanging. Now, units reported that Shermans were staying in formation, supporting the fight longer, and absorbing punishment long enough for infantry to get across fields, into buildings, or through choke points. This changed the calculus for combined arms doctrine entirely. Infantry commanders could now rely on tanks to be more than a short-lived battering ram. They became platforms for coordinated, sustained engagements, not just temporary hammers. That's a small, underappreciated ripple of wet stowage. It made not just tanks more effective, but everyone fighting near them, too. From doctrine to legacy. As the Allies stormed across Germany in the final weeks of the war, doctrinal adjustments codifying the practical changes were already getting drafted. Army field manuals began referencing enhanced survivability characteristics and rewrote armor engagement ranges to allow for closer, rolling advances supported by infantry. German crews were trained to accept hits rather than completely avoid them. That single mindset shift drastically altered their infield courage under fire. Even the concept of tank dueling, previously suicidal for Shermans, was now being considered tactically viable if coordinated with support fire or air cover. The new doctrine was simple but deadly. Take the punch. Close the gap. Counter with firepower. The tank won't save everyone, but it might save enough. An overlooked hero of victory. The truth is, there's no banner headline in history books about wet stowage. You won't find battlefield memorials labeled Water Jackets 1944. Most visitors at World War II museums stare at Sherman tanks behind glass without ever realizing they're looking at one of the most radical survivability innovations of the war. But make no mistake, thousands of men came home alive because of it. The system proved that killing isn't the only way to win in war. Sometimes, not dying is the edge that tips the scales. March 1945. The Rhine River, the last natural barrier to the heart of Nazi Germany. American tank crews lined the West Bank, engines rumbling like caged animals. The bridges were either blown or barricaded. German resistance was fierce, and the final battles would be some of the most costly. But inside those Shermans sat men who now knew something they hadn't felt in months: they might actually make it home. Because this time, they weren't riding into battle hoping they wouldn't burn. They were riding in tanks that had proven they could take the hit and give one back. The final push begins. The 22nd of March, 1945. Allied forces launched a full-scale crossing of the Rhine. It marked the beginning of the end. Shermans, now equipped almost exclusively with wet stowage systems, spearheaded armored battle groups cutting through the last pockets of German resistance. German tank crews, reduced to understrength units filled with barely trained recruits and cobbled together equipment, did everything they could: desperate ambushes, roadblocks, anti-tank squads armed with Panzerfausts pulled from crates built 2 years earlier. But the nightmare continued. Shermans were getting hit and not dying. Crews bailed out. Crews stayed in. Tanks rolled over mines and flares, took direct hits from 75mm and 88mm rounds, and returned fire anyway. Müller's last stand. Veteran Panzer Commander Klaus Müller, who had first encountered the upgraded Shermans near Falaise, now found himself in the ruins of Frankfurt, commanding a ragtag unit of Hitler Youth, aging veterans, and half-destroyed Panzer IVs. He'd seen the war from the start, from glory to ash, from Africa to the collapse of Berlin's outer defenses. And here, in the final stretch, he recognized something chilling. The tactics they had used for years didn't work anymore. In a half-shattered building turned command post, Müller turned to his radio operator. "They're still sending Shermans, same tanks. They look the same. And they keep coming. We're fighting yesterday's war against tomorrow's enemy." German intelligence too little, far too late. In Cologne, Colonel Max Weber of German military intelligence dragged a stack of blurred photos across a steel desk in a bombed-out schoolhouse. Dozens of frames captured the same haunting pattern. Sherman tanks blasted open by direct hits, with no sign of interior fires. Crews huddled behind still smoking hulls, still alive. Ground units repairing battle-damaged tanks on the same day, putting them back into action. And most of those damaged tanks identified as wet stowage M4A3S. But Weber had a problem. He couldn't prove it. His staff scrounged every intact Sherman they could find. The few that weren't demolished were still using earlier dry stowage layouts pre-1944 variants. It was a deception, hidden not by secrecy, but by American success at recovering or destroying their own before the enemy could learn anything. The final German realization. It wasn't until captured American manuals were recovered following the fall of several outlying depots that German command finally pieced it together. They had been firing at a weakness that no longer existed for almost a year. High command was stunned. "Had we known the vulnerability was addressed," reported one German chief engineer in a classified memo, "our anti-tank doctrine would have required a fundamental shift by early summer 1944. Instead, we operated under obsolete assumptions, with fatal consequences." But by the time they understood what wet stowage was, they were in full retreat through their own homeland. A war lost by inches. By late April, German defensive lines were collapsing everywhere. Fuel was gone. Artillery was down to emergency shells. Infantry carried rifles with barely enough bullets for a single engagement. But even as the cities fell, the psychological legacy of wet stowage played out in battlefield after battlefield. Sherman crews advanced faster than ever. Units engaged at closer range, confident in their tanks' resilience. Infantry used Shermans like armored walls, pressing through doorways, farmhouses, and bullet-riddled intersections, knowing those tanks wouldn't simply light up like kindling. And the Germans? They surrendered in shocking numbers. Some panzers didn't even fire crews, having seen too many hits go nowhere. The moment, the secret was out. May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war was over, and in a series of POW interrogations in newly liberated depots, German commanders were finally told the truth. One American liaison simply opened a cross-section diagram of a Sherman tank, tapped the ammunition rack, and translated the words "water-jacketed stowage compartments." Standard from March 44 forward. There was no boast, no gloating, just truth. Oberst Friedrich von Manstein, now a prisoner, stared at the sketch for a long time. "That's all it was?" he asked. "A water tank?" The American smiled. "That's all it took." Von Manstein nodded slowly, half in awe, half in despair. "We lost how many men? Because we never thought to ask where the ammunition went." Post-war reflections. A silent superpower. In the quiet that followed the war, Dr. Richard Patterson, the American engineer who proposed the wet stowage concept, finally released a public-facing version of his internal report, Statistical Analysis of Tank Survivability Among Wet Stowage-Equipped Shermans shows a 73% reduction in ammunition fires compared to pre-modification variants. The expected survivability of tank crews increased in proportion, sparing an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 lives in late-stage European combat. It wasn't dramatic like radar. It wasn't glamorous like the atomic bomb. But pound for pound, wet stowage was one of the most decisive battlefield innovations of the Allied campaign. The legacy endures. Post-war military schools studied it. Not just the hardware, but the strategy of it. How an overlooked flaw nearly cost the US complete control over armored combat in Europe. How a relatively simple, elegant fix flipped the psychological battlefield. And how engineering, when paired with secrecy and timing, could deal devastating damage to enemy confidence. Even Soviet tank designers, after analyzing captured Shermans in the final months of the war, began experimenting with liquid barrier ammunition storage in their evolving T-series designs. And in the US, the lessons of the Sherman silent savior were baked into every tank that followed. M48 Patton, M60, and later, the M1 Abrams all carried forms of protected, armored ammunition stowage as standard. The philosophy was clear. Survivability wasn't optional. It was a battlefield multiplier. O'Brien's tank, the museum piece that should have been a tomb. One Sherman crewed by Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien. The same man who survived multiple hits during the Battle of the Bulge was later recovered and cleaned up after the war. It had taken 3 confirmed penetrations, suffered heavy hull damage, and was expected to be scrapped. But when engineers cut it open, they found all the ammo racks intact. Water jackets still partially sealed. Not a trace of fire damage. That tank was eventually shipped home, and today, it sits on display at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Visitors walk past it every day. They read its name, maybe take a picture, but few understand the quiet miracle nestled inside it. Not armor, not weaponry, just engineering and water. Final words. The secret they never saw. Of all the enemies American soldiers faced in World War II, perhaps the deadliest was the one they brought with them into battle: faulty design, bad assumptions, and silence. And yet, through brains, risk, and timing, the Allies fixed the Sherman's biggest flaw in the middle of a war they couldn't afford to lose, and they did it so effectively, the enemy never even saw it happen. That's the legacy of wet stowage. It didn't explode. It didn't need to. It just changed the game and let Americans keep fighting long enough to end it. The fighting stopped in Europe on the 8th of May, 1945. But the impact of one small design decision, one water-filled jacket hidden inside a tank, didn't. In fact, long after the war was over, after the names of battles faded from memory and the Sherman was decommissioned from active service, the technology that saved thousands of lives kept working, quietly shaping the next era of warfare, and even the way we build safety systems today. A victory measured by what didn't happen. The wet stowage system's victory wasn't measured in conquest. It wasn't about how many tanks it destroyed or how many towns it took. It was about the things it prevented from happening. Thousands of tanks that didn't catch fire. Thousands of funerals that never had to be held. Thousands of families that didn't lose a son, a husband, a brother. By the time the last German city fell, Allied command estimated that more than 2,000 American tankers had directly benefited from survivability improvements tied to wet stowage implementation. In many cases, the tank still lost the fight, but the crew didn't. And in crude warfare, keeping people alive often matters much more than preserving machines. From battlefields to blueprints, the Cold War begins. With the war over, American engineers, military theorists, and manufacturers studied what worked and what nearly cost them everything. The lessons from wet stowage were baked into the blueprints of every U.S. tank design moving forward. The M26 Pershing, originally delayed during the war and suffering in early engagements due to rushed production, later implemented safer ammo compartment design patterns. The M48 Patton series, developed during the early Cold War years, prioritized crew survivability over raw speed, direct influence from the Sherman lesson. The M60, America's longest-serving main battle tank of the Cold War, included armored ammo compartments as standard, carrying forward the functional DNA of wet stowage. And by the time the M1 Abrams rolled off the line, U.S. military philosophy had fundamentally transformed. Explosive rounds were stored in blowout compartments behind fireproof access doors. The tank was built so a hit to the ammo wouldn't mean instant death for the crew. It all came from one simple idea. Don't make firepower your only strength. Make survivability part of it. A global influence, even among former enemies. Ironically, the same system that the Germans never understood during the war became something their Cold War successors studied intently. When Soviet forces examined wet stowage Shermans left in Europe or shipped through post-war military aid, they began reassessing their own tank design processes. Throughout the Cold War, Soviet T-series tanks incorporated protected ammo racks with sealing or blast mitigation layouts. Designs like the T-55 and T-72 used internal compartmentalization that bore distinct genetic resemblance to what U.S. engineers had pioneered with wet stowage. And it wasn't just tanks. Engineer Colonel Pavel Doronov of the Soviet Armored Research Bureau, interviewed post-Cold War, stated, "When examining Shermans, we found primitive solutions that yielded critical survivability results. We took those lessons into new fireproof materials, fuel cell separation, even hatch placement." The failure to recognize wet stowage during the war had cost Germany dearly. Its rediscovery in peacetime helped reshape global armored warfare strategy for decades to come. Civilian applications, from tanks to traffic. Here's where the story takes a surprising turn. Just like many World War II technologies, radar, jet engines, even duct tape, the logic behind wet stowage didn't stay on the battlefield. It entered civilian life. In the late 1940s and early 50s, American automotive manufacturers, especially defense contractors like Chrysler and GM, began using military lessons to improve vehicle safety. Fuel systems were rerouted. Explosive-sensitive components like batteries were isolated. Passenger compartments were surrounded by crumple zones and reinforced supports. All of it echoed one simple principle. If the dangerous part explodes, make sure times it doesn't kill the driver too. And in the same way, wet stowage added simple, liquid-based insulation to life-saving effect. The automobile industry began experimenting with the kind of liquid suppressants and spatial separation now taken for granted in modern crash safety design. Was it a one-to-one copy? No. But the thinking pattern, the design logic, came directly from wartime innovation. Remembering the quiet hero. Today, if you walk through the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, the Imperial War Museum in London, or Armor Branch exhibits at Fort Moore in Georgia, you'll see Shermans on display. Steel giants. Some scorched, some gleaming, some you can walk right into, some with stories behind their plating. But very few visitors, even historians, take more than a passing glance at the one lonely line on a placard that reads, "This vehicle is fitted with the wet stowage ammunition compartment design, implemented starting March 1944. That's it. No fire, no flash, no famous photo. Just a standard nobody noticed until nobody died. A final battlefield irony. There's something deeply poetic and a little haunting about how wet stowage remained hidden from the Germans during the war. It wasn't some ultra-classified alien tech. It wasn't buried deep in underground labs. It was on the battlefield the entire time, sitting a few feet from the flames, protecting Americans who didn't always understand why they were still alive, only that they were. And the Germans, so precise, so technically advanced, never saw it. Not because they weren't smart enough, but because, in war, the things you overlook are often the things that collapse your assumptions. Sometimes, the greatest strength isn't what makes the enemy bleed. It's what keeps your own men breathing. Epilogue. Staff Sergeant O'Brien's final words. Years after the war, Michael O'Brien, the tank commander who survived alternating shell impacts during the Battle of the Bulge, was asked by a journalist what the turning point of the war was for him. He didn't mention D-Day or Patton, not even the end of the war. He simply said, "The first time I heard someone yell, 'We're still alive, get back on the gun,' that's when I knew we weren't just surviving the war anymore. We were winning it." Final thought: the power of the unseen. The story of wet stowage is more than just mechanical engineering or military doctrine. It's a story about what happens when people decide to fix the thing no one is talking about. When lives are lost, not because of enemy skill, but because of silence, bureaucracy, fear of disruption, or denial. But someone somewhere decides to say, "What if we tried just one small change?" And that change spreads, saves lives, wins battles, shifts history. Not every secret weapon is loud. Sometimes history turns because someone put water around a box of ammo and refused to let men burn anymore. The end of the war didn't just belong to the strongest tank. It belonged to the smartest solution, hidden in plain sight.